In this part, we will see through the first part of the expedition of Nearchus the Cretan and his sailors up to the end of the lands of Gedrusia. Nasty weather at the sea, small city conquering, skirmishes with primitive tribes, naval battles with whales, and mysterious islands await you on this epic journey. The journey began after the monsoons, in the autumn of 325 BC, as these winds hinder maritime navigation. The ships were stationed in their naval station in Indus. A notable characteristic of the Greeks was their tendency to organize athletic and musical competitions, and make sacrifices for every significant event. After they finished all that, the journey began. From the naval station, they covered only 150 stadia in 5 days, with several stops. They even had to dig a long canal of about 5 stadia length, to avoid a shoal, until they reached the Crocales, an island in the delta. After a short journey, with a small mountain to their left, they arrived at a natural port. That port, they named it the Port of Alexander because it seemed safe. The areas in front of the delta are constantly changing, so it is very hard to tell where they were at that point. They stayed there for another 24 days, due to strong winds, and had to fortify the area to prevent enemy attacks. They were forced to drink brackish water, hunt mice, and collect shellfish like clams. The next day, after a short journey, they anchored on a sandy beach, with a small island, serving as a breakwater. They found water at about 20 stadia away from the shore. Although the land army wouldn't pass through this area, digging wells would soon become a daily routine. They needed to dig wells in order to support each other, as the journey would be parallel, from land and sea through Gedrusia. The next day, after sailing for a while, they reached an area with very narrow and dangerous reefs, which caused delays. The passage of the ships, from the narrow reefs, was finally completed a day later. Then, a sudden storm hit them, and they had to travel a considerable distance, in stormy seas, but they were relieved to have passed the narrow strait. They then entered a natural, circular, and deep harbor, the Harbor of Women. That area was named so, because the first ruler of the area was a woman. The next day, their journey continued with a long, narrow island on their left, wooded with a variety of trees. It ran parallel to the coast, and they feared it might be a strait. This passage had a length of approximately 70 stadia. After spending the night on the island, they left through a narrow and shallow passage ahead. Shortly after, they reached the mouth of the Arrianos River, but again they were forced to go inland in order to find water, as the river's waters were brackish. Up until this point, the area was inhabited by Indian tribes. At one point, Arrian tells us that Nearchus mentions a strange phenomenon. Some ever-visible stars, in the polar cycle, which we mentioned and explained in another video, began to set and rise, as they sailed further south into the open Indian Ocean. There were also areas where, when the sun was at its zenith, there was no shadow at all. In the region of the Ority, after anchoring in shallow waters, some of the men disembarked, in order to collect water. The next day, after covering quite some distance, they were hit by a very fierce wind, resulting in the destruction of 3 of the ships. After rescuing the shipwrecked sailors, who had swum to the nearby shore, they were forced to sail through the night to avoid the storm. Nearchus then had them camp on land, because everyone was exhausted. Nearby, Alexander had sent grain to supply the fleet, following Leonatus' victory over the Ority. Nearchus then went and met with Leonatus, and replaced the weaker of his sailors with soldiers. They stayed there for a day, to resupply, rest, and repair the ships. The next day, they anchored near the river Tumorus, after a long day in the sea. There, around 600 spear-bearing locals, seemingly ready for close combat, stood bewildered on the shore, as they saw the ships. Nearchus then sent his most agile men to swim to the shore, and form 3 lines of hoplites, while his archers prepared, keeping their distance. When everyone was in place, the attack began simultaneously, with volleys of arrows and catapult fire, war cries to Enyalius, and a charge. The locals were flustered and fled. From the descriptions of the captives, it seems that this tribe was still in the Mesolithic period. Hairy, with beast-like claws, used to cut fish and soft wood, they reserved their stone tools for harder materials and hunting. In that spot, they stayed for another 5 days, to repair the ships. We assumed that they hadn't completed the repairs at the last stop. When they set off again, during the day they passed the borders of the region of the Ority. From this point onwards, they would encounter the Drosians, mostly inland, and the Ichthyofagoi, fish-eaters, along the coast. In the following days, they sailed past a very long, narrow peninsula, steep and high. They avoided reefs, shoals, and rocky outcrops, and searched for the very precious water during their stops. They did not face any problems with the locals. On the contrary, on one of these days, when they disembarked in a coastal village called Kalima, the locals from an island, about 100 stades from the sea, brought them gifts, including 2 sheep. However, these sheep, as they had been feeding on fish, due to the lack of grass, also tasted like fish. On another day, they anchored at a fishing village but found none of the locals. It seemed that they had been frightened by the ships and fled. Nearchus soldiers, not finding any grain, took a few of the abandoned boats, and continued their journey. They continued for a while longer, sailing around a high cape, and reached yet another quiet harbor, with a peaceful Drosian fishing village, called Mosana, where they replenished their water supply. They also got a Drosian man, as guide. They set off at night, and continued throughout the day, making only 3 stops. They began to encounter some cultivated lands, and fishermen with primitive boats. That night, they departed again, around midnight. They had several successive stops, until they anchored in an area, where there was a city on a hill, near the sea. Nearchus, realizing they would not be given food willingly, decided, along with Arrias of Pella, to take the city by force. He sent the fleet ahead with Arrias, and stayed behind, using the excuse that he wanted to see the city. He gave instructions to Arrias for the fleet to hide, and then lead a group of hoplites to land on the shore and wait for his signal. Nearchus went to the city then, along with a few men and their guide, and the locals came out to greet him, with cooked tuna and fruits from the region. Accepting their gifts, he asked to enter the city, and they permitted him. Once inside, Nearchus gave the signal for his archers to secure the gate, while he and the others signaled to Arrias, who was hiding nearby. The guide requested food, and the city was captured without much effort. However, these people had very little flour from grains. The flour they did have was made from ground fish. They took what they could find and left. These were the last Ichthyofagoi, fish eaters, they encountered, who ate cooked fish. They departed again at midnight, and for the next 3 days, they traveled day and night. Nearchus avoided bringing them ashore, fearing they would desert due to hunger. On one occasion, when he let them disembark, they found and ate 7 camels, that some poor and frightened locals had abandoned. One day, they saw water spouts, and the sailors, terrified, asked the helmsman what it was. They explained that in the open sea, giant sea creatures lived, which spouted water like that. The sailors were bewildered. Nearchus sailed back and forth with his ship in order to encourage them, advising them to strike the rows in the water, to line up for a naval battle, to shout and blow their trumpets. When their sounds synchronized, the creatures, which were now very close, got frightened and dove beneath the surface, later resurfacing far away. From this unexpected victory, everyone praised Nearchus for his wisdom. These creatures, sometimes, are washed ashore, and the Ichthyofagoi, fish eaters, make their houses from them, as they can be up to 25 fathoms long, about 45 meters. Now, the Icthyofagoi live primarily on fish, which they catch mostly during low tide. Very few of them know how to fish, or cultivate land. However, they do have some nets, with which they catch fish, left behind by the tide. The small and soft fish, they eat raw on the spot, while the larger ones are dried in the sun, and made into flour, and they make oil from the shells that they get. Even their livestock are fed with dried fish, as there is poor or no vegetation in the area. There is also a myth about the Ichthyofagoi, related to an island, where ships seemed to disappear, just as one of Nearchus' ships vanished. A Nereid would transform people into fish, but the sun became enraged with her, as the island was dedicated to him. She then asked for mercy, for those she had wronged, and the sun transformed them back into humans. These are the Icthyofagoi. When Nearchus ordered one of his other ships to sail around the island, to search for the lost ship, while the rest of the fleet would call out to them from afar, no one dared to go out of fear. So, Nearchus went himself with his ship, and even disembarked on the island, proving to his superstitious men that the rumors were untrue.